Welcome to this exploration of one of the most unsettling incidents in Arkansas history. Please let me know where you're watching from and what time you're listening to this narration in the comments section before we start. What locations and times of day or night these recorded stories reach are of interest to us. Located in the untamed Ozark Mountains of Newton County, Arkansas, the town of Jasper is now a peaceful place where residents greet one another on Main Street and tourists pause for gas. However, in 1920, this remote area of America was home to a mystery that would forever alter the collective memory of the area. One of the most puzzling incidents in Arkansas's criminal history occurred at the Coons property, which is located 6 miles northwest of the city along what is now County Road 74. As was customary, the bell of the First Methodist Church of Jasper sounded on the morning of Sunday, October 17, 1920. One face was noticeably missing as the congregation walked in, greetings and nods being exchanged, that of Ezra Coons, a 47-year-old handyman and farmer who, in spite of his reputation as a recluse, had never missed a Sunday service in 20 years. The Newton County Historical Society has church records that show that Reverend Thomas Whitfield wrote the following in the margin of his sermon notes: E.C. absent. Unusual. Sheriff Milton Pewitt rode out to the Coons homestead by midweek, when Ezra was still unable to be found in town to pick up his mail, or buy supplies at Wilson's General Store, as was his Wednesday habit. What he discovered there would become the focus of the official investigation, gossip, and conjecture that continued long into the 1960s, when the final surviving witness passed away, bringing some secrets with him. Since 1899, the Coons family had owned the about 85 acres of primarily forested land, of which 20 had been cleared for farming. Situated on a small elevation with a view of the Buffalo River to the south, the main house was a 2-story building made of native oak and pine. A ramshackle barn sagged at an awkward angle behind the home. According to Sheriff Pewitt's first report, a padlock that looked remarkably modern in comparison to the property's weathered state was used to secure a root cellar that was dug into the slope east of the house. Not only did Ezra Coons vanish, but what was found in the house, the conflicting stories from the few people who knew him, and the unexplained occurrences described by others who later lived on or studied the property, was what made the case so strange. Newton County Courthouse records state that the case was officially closed in 1923 with the designation "whereabouts unknown," presumed deceased. However, documents discovered in 1968 during a courthouse renovation point to a more nuanced story that may have been too complicated for the authorities at the time to fully investigate. Photographs, interview transcripts, and personal belongings in a box of files labeled simply Coons 1920 in the dusty attic of the Newton County Courthouse provide a different account than the official record. This story is based on these materials as well as diaries, letters, and oral histories gathered from Jasper residents by local historian Martha Burrows between 1945 and 1962. What follows is a trip into the darkest recesses of loneliness, delusion, and the dreadful weight of secrets carried for too long. Not just the story of a man who disappeared. There had never been a large or especially gregarious Coons family. According to county records, Ezra's father, Jeremiah Coons, came to Newton County in 1891 with his wife, Sarah, and their only child, Ezra, who was 18 at the time. They bought the land from a Harrison banker who had bought it after a foreclosure. Burroughs' inquiries revealed a local legend that the property's former owners had abruptly left it, leaving behind clothing, furniture, and even food on the table. According to modern narratives, Jeremiah was a man of few words who frequently went to church but took part in very little in local affairs. He was harsh but fair. Those who recalled Sarah described her as even more quiet, speaking only when directly addressed and rarely leaving the town. The medical notebook of Dr. Wilfred Hoskins from 1897 states, Mrs. C. displays melancholia and nervous disposition. Prescribed laudanum tincture, 15 drops as needed for sleep. Sarah passed away in 1899 from what was described as wasting illness, although Dr. Hoskins suspected tuberculosis in private. Jeremiah and Ezra remained on the land after Sarah passed away, cultivating enough food to support themselves and selling extra in the neighborhood market. In 1907, Jeremiah was discovered dead while laboring in the fields, perhaps from heart failure. Ezra, who was 34 at the time, was left alone on the property. Tax documents show that he kept ownership and carried on farming, albeit on a smaller scale. He earned extra money by working as a handyman in Jasper, where he gained a reputation as a competent woodworker and dependable, if little strange, worker. He could fix just about anything, Burroughs said in a 1945 interview with Thomas Wilson, who owned Wilson's general shop. Quiet fellow, kept to himself, but did good work. Always paid his debts promptly, always in cash. Never saw him smile, not once in all those years. Few people were aware that Ezra had more formal schooling than was typical for rural Arkansas in those days. Harrison attended school through the 10th grade, according to his records, and excelled in the natural sciences and mathematics. According to a note from his old teacher that was found during Burroughs' investigation, young Ezra was uncommonly bright but socially withdrawn, with peculiar interests in geology and astronomy not covered by our curriculum. Ezra's innate tendency toward isolation was probably made worse by the Coons' remote location. The Hargrove family, who lived over 2 miles away, was the closest neighbor. In a 1946 interview, Eliza Hargrove noted that although her father occasionally hired Ezra to do carpenter work, he found him uncomfortable to be around for extended periods of time. Father gave him coffee and sent him home, she recalled. Said it was just foxfire or lightning bugs, but Ezra insisted it was something else. Entirely. Something that moved with purpose. In 1917, she recounted an incident in which Ezra arrived at their farm before dawn and claimed he had walked all night after seeing strange lights in the woods near his property. Ezra's disappearance was all the more obvious because of his routine. He would come into town every Wednesday just after noon, pick up his mail, buy supplies at Wilson's, and sometimes make a visit to the barber shop. Every Sunday, he went to church, sat in the same pew toward the back, and left right away without taking part in the traditional social event. No one knew that he had any close acquaintances or confidants, and he never got married. Ezra Coons was last seen on Wednesday, October 13, 1920, during his routine visit to the city. Coffee, flour, salt, kerosene, and 3 boxes of .30-30 rifle ammo were all purchased, according to Wilson's ledger. This last item is a little out of the ordinary because Ezra usually only bought ammunition in November, just before hunting season. According to the postal log, he picked up 2 pieces of mail, an unknown letter from St. Louis, Missouri, and the monthly Arkansas Farmer and Homesteader newsletter. Burroughs was informed by Clarence Jenkins, who worked at the post office in 1920, that Ezra was angry when he picked up his mail that day. Usually, he'd just nod and pocket the letters, Jenkins stated. That day, he tore open the St. Louis letter right there at the counter, read it twice. His hand was shaking. When I asked if everything was all right, he looked at me like he'd forgotten I was there, said something like, "It's confirmed, then," and walked out without another word. At Wilson's store, Ezra's actions were also standard. Thomas had never before exhibited interest in a county map, but his wife, Grace Wilson, saw that he looked at it for about 20 minutes. She heard him murmuring about northern boundaries, and convergence points. He quickly went back to his shopping when she asked if he needed instructions. Perhaps the most unsettling story of Ezra's last appearance in town came from Samuel Ritter, the barber. Ritter told Sheriff Puett that instead of getting his typical haircut, Ezra requested a mirror so he could look at the back of his neck. "Never seen a man so concerned about the back of his neck," Ritter said. "He kept twisting around, trying to see it from different angles. Asked me if I could see anything unusual there. I told him there was nothing but a birthmark he'd always had. He seemed relieved but said, 'If it changes, if it starts to look different, you tell the sheriff right away.' Strangest request I ever had in 30 years of barbering." The site seemed strangely unaltered when Sheriff Puett arrived at the Coons property on Thursday, October 21st. At first glance, nothing appeared to be missing inside, and the front door was unlocked, which was normal in rural Arkansas at the time. On the kitchen table was a half-full, now cold coffee cup. As though Ezra had merely moved aside for a second, a chair was dragged out. His coat hung by the door, but his rifle, a Winchester Model 1894, was not to be seen where it usually hung above the fireplace. The condition of Ezra's bedroom was the most odd feature, according to Puett's assessment. The bed was prepared, but clothes were spread out in the form of a human, with a hat at one end and boots at the other. Next to this arrangement was a tiny wooden box with some folded papers, which Puett entered into evidence, saying it looked as if someone had laid out clothes to resemble a sleeping man. No immediate evidence of foul play was found during a search of the property. In its stall, Ezra's mule was being fed and watered appropriately. The hens looked well cared for. When the root cellar was unsealed, it held provisions, cured meats, and preserved veggies, as well as something unexpected. Puett found a little entrance about 3 feet high in the far corner, partially obscured by shelves of mason jars. In his study, Puett said, "It looks to be an entrance to a secondary chamber." Photographs taken by Puett's deputy, Vernon Ellis, reveal walls covered with newspaper clippings, hand-drawn maps, and what appear to be personal letters. Upon opening, found a space approximately 8 by 10, containing a table, chair, and numerous papers affixed to the walls. The nature of these papers and their significance is unclear at this time. On the table was a leather-bound journal and a kerosene lamp. This journal and a few more papers from the walls were gathered as proof and thoroughly explained in an addition to Puett's report from October 23, 1920. Questions were immediately raised about the existence of the concealed room. The root cellar was constructed by the property's prior owners, not the Coons family according to county records. Had Ezra built the secret room himself, or had he found it when he first moved onto the property? The building appeared to be older than Ezra's time there, and the supporting beams were quite old. The reason such a chamber was constructed in the first place was even more perplexing. It was too small for useful storage and too awkward for frequent usage, but it was finished with unexpected care, including a wooden floor while the main cellar had just packed earth. The journal, which spans the months of January 1919 through October 12, 1920, shows a slow but noticeable decline in Ezra's mental health. Early postings are routine. They document the weather, farm work, and sporadic encounters in town. However, the entries become more fragmented and paranoid by the middle of 1920. In February 12, 1920, Ezra wrote, "Check the north field boundary again today. The stones have moved, I'm certain of it. Measured the distance to the large oak, now 127 paces, 142 last fall. No natural explanation." By May, Ezra had started to report strange noises. Tapping in the walls again last night. Not mice or insects, too rhythmic, almost like code. Lasted from midnight until just before dawn, sleep impossible. By June, his worries grew. They're watching the house again. Came back from the north field and saw fresh tracks by the, not animal. Too deliberate. They're getting bolder. By September, Ezra's entries indicated that he was sleeping in the hidden room. Safer here. They can't get through these walls as easily. The old symbols Father carved seem to slow them down. Must remember to lock the outer cellar door. The final entry, dated October 12th, the day before Ezra's last trip to town, contained just 4 words. It's in the walls. Some of the newspaper clippings discovered in the secret room date back to 1899, the year Sarah Coons passed away, and mostly dealt with unexplained deaths and disappearances in Arkansas and the surrounding states. A clipping from the Arkansas Gazette, dated October 26, 1899, reported the disappearance of a trapper named Elias Whitby from an area about 40 miles north of the Coons property. Many of them bore Ezra's annotations, such as one about a missing family in Washington County from 1915, beside which he had written, "Same pattern, always in October." According to the story, Whitby had been acting strangely in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, saying he had found something out of the ordinary in a system of caves. In addition to this article, Ezra had written, "Mother knew him." Said he visited Father once. What did they discuss? According to another clipping from 1907, the year Jeremiah passed away, a perfectly circular depression that had formed overnight in a field close to Fayetteville was a natural phenomenon. It was ascribed to karst action by geologists. However, Ezra had scribbled in the margin, "Same as Father found." Not natural, and underlined a few words. Letters from Ezra to a man known only as R.M. from St. Louis were among the documents gathered from the walls. The letters, written between 1918 and 1920, describe what they call the phenomenon and mention similar incidents elsewhere. The identity of R.M. was unknown to investigators at the time, but the last letter from him, postmarked October 10, 1920, and probably one of the pieces of mail Ezra gathered on his final trip to town, warns, "Do not attempt further investigation alone. Will arrive by month's end. Tell no one." The building listed, according to city records Burroughs obtained in 1952, had housed the offices of the Midwestern Society for Geological Research, a small private organization that dissolved in 1921. Shortly after Ezra's disappearance. Inquiries sent to the return address in St. Louis returned the message, "No such person at this address." According to Deputy Ellis's personal notes, which Burroughs was able to get, the most unsettling object discovered in the concealed area was a little leather purse that contained what looked like human teeth. They belonged to at least 3 separate people, according to laboratory analysis done at the state capitol. The official case file contains no mention of this material, and though Ellis described it in great detail in his contemporaneous notes, he denied having any memory of it when Burroughs asked him about it in 1950. Since there was no concrete evidence of a crime, and the circumstance was uncommon, Sheriff Pewitt initially categorized the case as a missing person investigation. On October 24th, a search party was assembled, and they searched the Buffalo River's banks and the adjacent forests, but they were unable to locate Ezra or his rifle. The investigation halted since there was no corpse and no obvious sign of foul play. In the northern area of the land, Luther Holcomb, a member of the search group, reported seeing odd patterns cut into trees. Sheriff Pewitt rejected this conclusion, stating that they were probably ancient path markers or property boundary marks. He described them in his statement as kind of like letters, but not English or any language I know. But the next day, when Holcomb took a deputy back to the spot, he was unable to find the indicated trees once more, saying the area looked different somehow. The case's ongoing mystery was greatly enhanced by what transpired subsequently. The main home was completely destroyed after a fire started on the Coons property on November 2, 1920. The building had already collapsed when nearby residents saw the fire and came to the scene. Officially, the cause was listed as unknown. However, theories varied from intentional arson to an unattended kerosene lamp. The fire burned with an unusual color, not orange or red, but almost blue-white, especially at the center, and it made a sound, not crackling like normal fire, but a low humming that made your teeth ache. Eliza, the daughter of James Hargrove, who took part in the unsuccessful attempt to put out the fire, later recalled that the flames behaved unlike any fire I've ever seen. The root cellar and its hidden room, curiously, survived the fire. Despite being logged into evidence at the sheriff's office, the diary was missing, and all documents had been taken down from the walls when they were later inspected. Years later, when asked about this disparity, former Deputy Ellis stated that the journal and articles had never been returned after being transferred to the state capitol for analysis. State records, which indicate no receipt of such evidence, contradicted Ellis's statement. Ellis's sudden departure from Newton County and his resignation from the sheriff's position in December 1920 were more concerning. In 1923, he reappeared in Oklahoma, where he was employed as an oil field night watchman. He was living in a modest Tulsa apartment when Burroughs found him in 1950, and his landlord said he had terrible nightmares and a nervous condition that makes him afraid of the dark. The county started probate procedures in December 1920, since Ezra was still unaccounted for and thought to be deceased. Normally, the property would have escheated to the state because Ezra had no known successors. But on December 18th, a man from St. Louis named Robert Marshfield showed up with papers stating that he was Ezra's second cousin and legitimate heir. Marshfield took ownership of the land when Judge William Hargrove determined that the documentation was enough. When Burroughs reviewed the documents decades later, they seemed to be truly old, but there were a number of discrepancies. On the page describing Marshfield's relationship to the Coons family, the family Bible that was used as evidence of the relationship displayed distinct paper and ink properties. More importantly, the branch of the family from which Marshfield claimed lineage was not included in church records from Ezra's birthplace in Tennessee that Burroughs acquired in 1958. When Marshfield arrived, Jasper became agitated. He employed local men to clear the burned house and start building a new, smaller cabin next to the original foundation. Some witnesses described him as tall, well-dressed, and speaking with what some regarded as an Eastern accent. Workers on the property said he also spent a lot of time exploring the underground area and root cellar. He had us dig all around that cellar. No, related to the sheriff James Pewitt remembered in an interview in 1947. Paid good money, but wouldn't say what he was looking for. Had us dig 6 feet down in some spots. Never found anything that I saw, but he seemed mighty interested in the soil itself. Kept taking samples in little glass jars. Marshfield's time in Jasper was brief. He sold the property to a Harrison cattle rancher by February 1921 and left. He sold the land for significantly less than its assessed worth according to property records. Although Martha Burroughs' inquiry turned up a death certificate for a Robert Marshfield in Philadelphia, dated October 17, 1925. Precisely 5 years after Ezra's absence was originally reported, it is unclear where he went after leaving Jasper. The coroner's notes, which Burroughs obtained through persistent correspondence with Philadelphia authorities, described injuries inconsistent with accident or common assault, including unusual markings on the posterior neck and upper spine. The coroner also noted that the body exhibited advanced decay inconsistent with time of death, making detailed examination difficult. The death certificate listed the cause of death as acute respiratory failure following severe trauma. Henry Gladwell, the cattle rancher who bought the property, merely used it for grazing and never resided there. Marshfield had constructed a modest hut, which was largely abandoned until Gladwell employed Vincent Holloway, a caretaker, to live on the property and oversee operations in 1927. The mystery is further complicated by Holloway's employment at the property. It was peaceful enough, if a bit lonely. By 1928, however, his letters to his sister in Little Rock, which are now in the Arkansas State Archives, adopted a more somber tone. August 1928. "There is something not right about this place," he wrote. "The cattle won't graze in the north field, no matter how green it gets. They just stand at the fence line and bellow, and the sounds at night like something moving in the walls of the cabin. Mr. Gladwell thinks it's raccoons, but I've trapped for them and found nothing." Holloway reported finding the remnants of the ancient root cellar and its secret compartment in September 1928. Found some strange carvings on the support beams, not just initials or dates, but complex designs, almost like writing, but not any alphabet I recognize, similar to what I've seen carved on some of the older trees up north. Explored the old cellar Mr. Gladwell mentioned. Most of it's collapsed now, but there's a section still intact, a small room behind the main space. Holloway reported discovering strange markings carved into trees at the northern boundary of the property in October 1928. He sent a rough sketch of symbols that resemble cattle marks but do not match any recognized marking used in the area, describing them as not letters exactly, nor pictures, but deliberate all the same. In 1960, Burroughs sought the opinion of a linguistics professor at the University of Arkansas, who studied the sketch and pointed out that it resembled several Native American pictographs, but was unable to pinpoint a particular tribe origin. More interestingly, he identified similarities to symbols discovered in southern Missouri archaeological sites that are thought to have existed for several centuries before recognized tribal communities. Plans to investigate a depression in the earth that he had found around a quarter-mile north of the cabin are mentioned in Holloway's last letter, which was dated October 15, 1928. The message included a rough map that showed the depression's location in relation to property features. It read, "Looks like a sinkhole starting, but perfect circle, about 6 feet across. Ground feels strange there. Hollow somehow. Going to check it tomorrow." In order to record what he discovered, he also stated that he planned to carry a camera that he had just bought from a catalog. "If there's a cave system down there, could explain some of the sounds I've been hearing. Sound carries strange ways underground." Gladwell dispatched 2 ranch hands to check on Holloway on October 18th, after he failed to pick up supplies that had been left for him in Jasper. They discovered the cabin deserted and undisturbed. All that was left of Holloway were his boots and coat. According to the men, they yelled for him and looked about the immediate area, but they refrained from going to the northern part of the property because it was getting dark and a storm was coming. There was a peculiar odor in the cabin, which one of the men described as like lightning just struck nearby, that sharp, burning smell. Another man saw marks on the floor, like something wet had been dragged across it, which led from the bedroom to the front door. This detail was missed at the time, but was brought to Burroughs' attention. Sheriff Leland Puett, son of Milton Puett, who had retired in 1926, carried out a more comprehensive search on October 20th, covering the entire property, including the depression Holloway had mentioned in his letter. The official report states that they discovered a circular area with a diameter of about 6 feet, where the soil had sunk nearly 18 inches. There was no indication of tunneling or any other cause for the subsidence. Holloway was nowhere to be seen, and there was no clue as to what had happened to him. About 50 yards from the dip, the search team found Find Holloway's camera dangling from a tree branch. 6 exposures were seen on the developed film, 5 of the circular depression taken from various perspectives, and a final picture that the developing technician said was too overexposed to make out clearly. This last picture was not in the case file and is thought to have been lost. Interest in the initial case was rekindled by this second abduction from the same home, which occurred nearly 8 years after Ezra's disappearance. Sheriff Leland Pewitt went through his father's files and tried to find the evidence that had been gathered in 1920, especially the documents from the hidden room and Ezra's notebook. However, according to county records, these things had been destroyed in a small fire at the courthouse in 1924. The fire was eventually judged to be arson, but no one was ever convicted, and it merely damaged the section used for storing evidence. Gladwell sold the cattle operation after Holloway vanished, and the area was left empty until 1935, when it was acquired by the newly established Ozark National Forest as part of a land acquisition program during the Depression. Forest rangers periodically utilized the cabin, but it was never occupied. Raymond Carter, a Forest Service employee, slept at the cabin for 3 nights in 1942 while conducting a resource survey. A curious entry for April 17th in his field notes, which are kept in the Forest Service archives in Harrison, reads, 2:15 a.m. I awoke to sound of scratching in walls. Too rhythmic for rodents, almost like Morse code, but no pattern I recognize, lasted approximately 45 minutes, then stopped abruptly. Will request maintenance check structure for infestation. Carter's notes for the next day detail his reconnaissance of the property, which included the finding of odd circular depressions in the northern section. He included a sketch that showed the depressions forming a rough semicircle opening to the north. He counted 7 such depressions, each measuring between 2 and 8 feet in diameter, all perfectly round, and arranged in what he called a pattern, suggesting deliberate placement rather than natural formation. The following week, Maintenance Supervisor Edward Gaines filed a maintenance report that states, examined cabin walls for evidence of pests. Found no access points or nests. Structure sound. Note observed unusual cold spot in northeast corner of main room. Possible draft source unidentified. Recommend further examination when budget permits. Gaines later informed Burroughs that he had discovered something unusual during his inspection, but that his superior had told him not to include it in the official report. Gaines said he found what looked like a bundle of cloth in a little hollow behind the wall in the northeast corner. He felt something like an electrical shock when he tried to take it off, which left his arm numb for a few days. No other inspections were recorded, and the lodge was used only intermittently during the 1940s and early 1950s. He brought this to the attention of the district ranger, who personally took the package away and instructed Gaines to forget about it. The cabin had become dilapidated and was removed by the Forest Service in 1953 as part of a refurbishment effort for facilities. However, the root cellar was strengthened and kept intact in case of an emergency. In a 1962 interview with Martha Burroughs, one of the workers, Oscar Jenkins, related a discovery uncovered during this remodeling that was not recorded in official Forest Service records. Jenkins claims that the items were pages torn from a journal, and the handwriting matched samples Burroughs showed him from documents known to be Ezra's. When we were shoring up the walls of, that old cellar, we found something wedged behind one of the support beams. Looked like it had been purposefully hidden there. A tin box, rusty but intact. Inside was a bundle of papers, wrapped in oilcloth, still readable. According to Jenkins, the site foreman told the workers to forget about it after seeing the contents of the box and took possession of the items. Jenkins said the pages contained ravings about something living in the woods, something that could change its shape. Said it had taken his mother, then his father, and was coming for him next. Said it needed the blood of his bloodline to stay in this world. Burroughs denied any knowledge of such a discovery when he tried to confirm this story with Charles Danning, the foreman. Less than a month following the repair project, in November 1953, Danning abruptly resigned his job and moved to Oregon, according to Forest Service records. In 1961, desperate to find Danning, Burroughs finally found him in a small Oregon seaside hamlet. According to her notes from their brief phone chat, Danning was first antagonistic and would not talk about his time in Arkansas. Danning reportedly became irritated when Burroughs specifically brought up the Coons property, saying, "How did you find me? Did they send you?" before cutting the discussion short. After unsuccessful attempts to set up an in-person interview, Danning relocated again soon after the conversation, leaving no forwarding address. The former Coons property was included in a 1955 geological survey of Newton County by the University of Arkansas, which described the area as having unusual subterranean features consistent with extensive cave formation. The report stated that the limestone composition of the area would normally result in more gradual and irregular karst development. So the perfectly circular surface expressions seen in the northern section were worthy of further study. In 1958, a team headed by Dr. Harold Winters, a geologist who specializes in karst topography, conducted a more thorough investigation of the area. Around a few of the depressions, Winters' team carried out small excavations, soil tests, and ground-penetrating radar surveys, at the time a relatively new technology. Several of Winters' colleagues were skeptical of their findings, which were published in a 1959 paper in the Journal of Speleological Studies. They described a network of chambers and passages at about 50 to 75 feet below surface level, exhibiting characteristics inconsistent with typical limestone dissolution processes. More controversially, Winters proposed that some features suggested possible anthropogenic modification of natural cave structures dating to an indeterminate pre-Columbian period. Nonetheless, a number of archaeologists with an interest in pre-Columbian cave use in the Ozark region took notice of the research. In 1962, Dr. Eliza Montgomery, one such archaeologist, was granted authorization to perform an initial examination of the site. In the vicinity of one of the larger depressions, she discovered artifact fragments of uncertain origin, including ceramic shards with ornamental elements that were inconsistent with recognized indigenous styles of the area, according to her field notes, which are preserved at the University of Arkansas. She suggested doing a thorough archaeological investigation, but financial limitations made this impossible. Montgomery kept an eye on the location even if her profession led her elsewhere. In a 1967 letter to Burroughs, she stated, "I remain convinced that something significant lies beneath that property, something that predates any recorded human habitation in the region. The patterns we observed suggest purpose, design, not random geological processes, but intentionality." When Martin Reynolds, a University of Arkansas geology student, was surveying karst formations in Newton County in 1965, it marked the end of the Ezra Coons case's recorded history. He investigated a large sinkhole formation on what had been the northern part of the Coons property, as documented in his field journal, which is preserved at the University Library. Sinkhole approximately 20 feet in diameter. Conical depression leading to a vertical shaft. Depth of shaft measured at 47 feet to a ledge, with a secondary drop beyond that point. Shaft walls show unusual smoothness, not typical of natural karst processes. planned to return with proper equipment for full descent. Reynolds returned on October 17, 1965, 45 years to the day after Ezra Coons was first reported missing. Peter Garrison, a fellow student who later gave an account of what happened, was with him. They set up a system of ropes and Reynolds went down into the shaft, Garrison said. Radio contact was kept up, and Reynolds described a chamber at the bottom of the secondary drop, about 75 feet below the surface, that was about 30 feet in diameter. Despite the warm autumn temperature above ground, Reynolds described the chamber as unnaturally cold and noted unusual formations on the walls that he first believed to be mineral deposits, but later identified as carvings or inscriptions of some kind. The most fascinating was his description of what seemed to be a perfectly circular opening in the floor of the chamber, like a well shaft but horizontal instead of vertical, leading deeper into the earth. Reynolds' final transmission, according to Garrison, was, "There's something else down here. Looks like, oh God, I think it's..." At that moment, the radio burst into static, followed by what Garrison described as a sound like no human voice I've ever heard. He also mentioned an odd acoustic quality, stating that his voice seemed to produce echoes that lasted longer than would be expected in a space of that size. Garrison tried to use their rope system to pull Reynolds up after he did not answer their calls. The end of the rope appeared, as Garrison put it, melted or dissolved rather than cut. Garrison immediately called for assistance, and a rescue effort was launched, arriving at the scene shortly before dusk. However, a recent development prevented access by the time rescue personnel were ready to descend. The shaft, which had been open and stable during Reynolds' descent, had completely collapsed. Multiple equipment failures, and what the incident report refers to as hazardous gas emissions, from the collapsed entrance led to the abandonment of subsequent excavation attempts. Although engineers consulted by Burroughs pointed out that such a rapid and total collapse would be exceedingly rare for a shaft that had exhibited no signs of weakness during Reynolds' descent just hours before, the official explanation attributed the collapse to natural geological instability. In 1966, a memorial plaque honoring Reynolds was erected close to the location by the University of Arkansas. The area was declared off-limits for safety reasons, according to Forest Service documents. Additionally, the sinkhole and 5 acres around it were fenced off in 1968. In 1967, Garrison conducted the last interview with Martha Burroughs about the Coons case. By that time, he had finished his degree in geology but had given up on pursuing graduate work. He originally declined to talk about the incident while he was employed as a science teacher at a Fort Smith high school. When he was finally persuaded, he added the official account. Before the static, before that inhuman sound, Martin said something else. He said, "The walls are moving." Those were his exact words. "The walls are moving." Just like what they found written in Ezra's journal. After what happened, I looked into the history of that place. Too many coincidences, too many disappearances, always in October, always without a trace. Additional information that Garrison had previously omitted was revealed in his account. In the days before their excursion, he said, Reynolds had been suffering from strange symptoms. Garrison talked about headaches, saying he said he felt like something was pressing against the back of his skull. He also talked about dreams, saying he had always the same dream, about standing in a circular room with symbols on the walls that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. But what worried him the most was that in the days before their trip, Reynolds had received an anonymous letter at his university office. The envelope only contained his name and no return address. An unfinished sketch of a circular depression with a human figure standing next to it for scale was found on a single sheet of paper within. Just 3 words appeared beneath the drawing. Not in October. Martin thought it was a prank from another student, Garrison said. Now, I'm not so sure. Garrison also disclosed that, in defiance of Forest Service rules, he had visited the location by himself in the spring of 1966. I had to know if anything remained, any evidence of what happened to Martin. The collapse had created a shallow basin, maybe 3 feet deep at the center. The soil in that basin was different, darker, almost black, with an oily sheen. When it rained, nothing grows there, not even weeds. I took a sample. Had a friend in the chemistry department analyze it. He couldn't identify some of the compounds. Said the molecular structure was unusual. When asked whether he thought there was a link between Reynolds's demise and that of Ezra Kuhn and Holloway, Garrison responded without hesitation. I'm certain of it. Whatever's under that ground has been taking people for a long time, and I think it's getting stronger, more active. The incidents are getting closer together. First Ezra, then 8 years later Holloway, then 37 years to Reynolds. But there have been others, I'm sure of it. People who went missing in those woods that were never connected to the pattern. After Burroughs passed away in 1969, her study and interview collection was given to the Newton County Historical Society, where it was mostly forgotten until the early 2000s, when local history became more popular, resulting to its rediscovery and cataloging. 2 years after Burroughs' passing, in 1971, an intriguing postscript to her work surfaced. About a mile north of the old Kuhn's property, in a secluded location, a survey team charting the recently created Buffalo National River found a set of stone cairns. The 12 cairns were positioned in a perfect circle, with a circumference of 50 feet. A larger pile of stones with a flat slab on top stood in the middle, and symbols resembling those mentioned in descriptions of the markings discovered by Holloway in 1928 had been cut into it. Dr. William Martinez, a Park Service archaeologist who surveyed the site, said that although the cairns had been intentionally built, weathering and the absence of related items made it hard to establish how old they were. Martinez recommended more research, but before this could be organized, severe flooding in the spring of 1973 drastically changed the landscape. In his report, he stated that the symbols bear no clear relationship to known indigenous petroglyph styles of the Ozark region, but he also suggested they might represent an idiosyncratic expression of folk magic practices documented among isolated communities in the area during the 19th century. The site was buried under several feet of silt and debris left by the floodwaters when researchers went back to take a closer look at the cairns. There was conjecture that the entire formation had been swept away after repeated attempts to move the precise location using survey coordinates failed. Michael Thornton, a Park Service ranger, reported discovering a lone standing stone in 1978, about half a mile away from the cairn circle's assumed site. The markings on the roughly 3-foot-tall, 18-inch-wide stone resembled those Martinez had recorded. Although Thornton took pictures of the stone, he did not note its precise location. Despite a thorough search, the stone was not located when he and the archaeological team returned 2 weeks later. Thornton asked to be moved to a different park the next year. In a letter that researchers obtained from him in 2005, he clarified his choice. After what I've seen and heard in those woods, I can't stay. The dream started after I found that stone. Always the same. I'm standing in a circle of stones and something is rising from the ground at the center. Something that has no fixed shape, but seems to be made of darkness itself. When I wake, my bed sheets are soaked with sweat, and I can still hear the whispering that filled the dream. Words and no language I recognize, but that somehow I almost understand. The Buffalo National River was created in 1972, and the old Coons property is now inside its borders. There are no obvious signs of human living on the site of the home and root cellar, which has been reclaimed by the forest. In 1982, a group of hikers who had entered the restricted area against the rules reported seeing a perfect circle of dead vegetation approximately 30 feet in diameter. Their account, filed with the Park Service but viewed with suspicion, states that the ground within the circle appeared charred as if by intense heat, despite the lack of evidence of a conventional fire. The area where the sinkhole was located is still restricted, simply marked on Forest Service maps as hazardous terrain, no entry. Upon conducting an investigation, park rangers discovered no such formation. However, they did observe that one hiker needed medical treatment for acute anxiety and disorientation following the incident. Dr. Samuel Crawford, a controversial character who has been involved in fringe theories regarding pre-Columbian societies in North America, led an unapproved archaeological trip in 1994 that sought to perform ground-penetrating radar surveys of the northern portion of the former Coons property. Before they could finish their job, Crawford and his 3 graduate students were captured by Park Service officers, but not before they collected some initial data. Crawford's advocacy of unconventional theories had already damaged his academic standing, and mainstream archaeologists largely disregarded the results of the condensed survey. According to professional geologists who reviewed the data, his raw data, which was published in a small journal of alternative archaeology, showed what looked like a series of perfectly circular chambers connected by straight passages approximately 60 feet below the surface. They suggested that the data likely represented natural cave formations, with the radar image's regular appearance being an artifact of the equipment's limitations. Until his passing in 2001, Crawford insisted that the formations were man-made, the product of an unidentified civilization that existed before all known North American civilizations. He linked the Coons property to a network of power sites throughout the Ozarks in his last published study. He linked these sites to the disappearances of Martin Reynolds, Vincent Holloway, and Ezra Coons, as well as a number of missing persons cases that spanned more than a century. Although academic circles did not accept Crawford's views, paranormal researchers and conspiracy theorists did take notice. The Park Service increased patrols and installed stronger fence in response to multiple unauthorized expeditions that tried to enter the restricted area in the 1990s and early 2000s. Dr. Laura Chen, a Park Service biologist, saw an odd vegetation pattern near the old Coons property in 2005 while conducting a standard resource management assessment. Soil samples from this area showed abnormal mineral content and pH levels inconsistent with the surrounding forest. Chen reported finding concentric rings of plant growth, with species composition shifting dramatically between rings. At the center of these rings, which were about 100 feet in diameter, she noted stunted growth and unusual morphology in otherwise common species. Chen suggested that these anomalies might be related to underground hydrological features affecting nutrient distribution, which was a reasonable explanation, but still suggested something unusual beneath the surface. Additionally, Chen noted that digital cameras and GPS units were among the many technological items that routinely malfunctioned in this location. The reason for this was possible electromagnetic interference from mineral deposits. She added that the pattern of malfunctions was itself unusual, with equipment failing only when pointed or directed toward the center of the concentric vegetation rings. Newton County had a number of small earthquakes in 2008, which was out of the ordinary for the area. University of Arkansas seismologists found a series of minor tremors with epicenters within a mile of the former Coons property, none of which were larger than 2.5 on the Richter scale. In 2009, follow-up surveys revealed that the tremors had drastically changed the subterranean landscape, with Dr. James Hardin, who analyzed the data, stating that the pattern of seismic activity was consistent with subsidence events rather than tectonic movement, suggesting the possibility of cave collapses or similar underground structural failures. In particular, the circular chambers found in Crawford's contentious 1994 survey were absent from the new data, suggesting that they had either completely collapsed or somehow been filled in. A comparison with previous geological data revealed what seemed to be substantial changes in the configuration of presumed cave systems, with some passages collapsing while others seemed to have expanded. It's still unclear what became of Ezra Coons, Vincent Holloway, Martin Reynolds, and perhaps others. A foundation of dates and fundamental information is provided by the official records. However, the truth can be found in the spaces between those facts, in the unaccounted-for evidence, in the conflicting stories, and in the odd findings accumulated over many years. A Jasper court clerk found a sealed envelope hidden under the cover of a 1920s property deed book in 2010 while digitizing historic county documents. A solitary sheet of paper in the aged, yellowed envelope bore what looked to be a handwritten note from Sheriff Milton Pewitt, dated November 5, 1920, a few days after the Coons property had burned down. The note, apparently never filed officially, read, "Found something at the Coons place that I can't explain. Didn't want to put it in the report. After the fire, when we were checking for hot spots, Thompson and I dug through the ashes where Ezra's bedroom had been. Under the floorboards, we found a metal box that survived the heat. Inside was what looked like a journal. Older than Ezra's, probably his father's from the dates. Most pages too damaged to read, but one had a drawing. A circle with smaller circles inside it, like a target. Next to it, written in what looked like blood, "It comes through the circles when October thins the veil. Thompson wanted to keep investigating, but I told him to leave it be. Some things shouldn't be disturbed. I'm putting this note here in case something happens to me. If you're reading this, be warned. Stay away from the North Field." The authenticity of this document remains disputed, with some suggesting it may be a modern forgery planted as a hoax. Nonetheless, the paper and ink dated to the correct era, and handwriting specialists who studied it came to the conclusion that it was consistent with other known examples of Pewitt's writing. Local historians' interest in the Coons case was rekindled by the finding. To explore the several possibilities regarding the disappearances connected to the site, the Newton County Historical Society hosted a panel discussion in 2012 with specialists in geology, archaeology, and folklore. The incident brought attention to the persistent enigma and its importance to local history, even though no agreement was achieved. The archaeologist who had briefly studied the site in 1962, Dr. Eliza Montgomery, broke decades of quiet on the topic in 2015, which was, perhaps, the most interesting development in recent years. In an interview with a local historical publication, Montgomery, who is now in her 80s and has retired from academia, stated that a discovery she made during her preliminary survey, which she had never mentioned in her formal report, was what initially drew her attention to the Coons land. "We found a chamber," she said, "not a natural cave, but something constructed. The entrance had been deliberately sealed with fitted stones, some weighing hundreds of pounds. We documented it, but didn't open it. That would have required resources we didn't have and permissions we couldn't get. I submitted photographs and coordinates separately to my department head, but they were never acknowledged. When I inquired later, I was told my materials had been misplaced. I always wondered if someone else went back there, someone with more authority than a junior archaeologist on her first field assignment." When asked why she had waited more than 50 years to share this information, Montgomery replied, "Fear?" At first, I was told in no uncertain terms that discussing unauthorized findings would end my career. Later, after I was established, it was easier to focus on other sites, other projects, but I've never forgotten what we found, or the symbols carved into those ceiling stones, the same symbols that keep appearing in every account of the Coons property, from Ezra's time to the present. Montgomery's claim could not be verified, as she had no surviving documentation of the alleged chamber, and the site itself had undergone significant changes in the decades since her survey. She took any further information to her grave when she passed away in 2017. There are still people in Jasper who whisper about the Coons case. They include hikers experiencing momentary confusion when passing close to the former property border, livestock refusing to graze in specific locations, and unusual noises in the woods north of town. According to them, October is when the veil between worlds thins, making it easier for whatever lurks in the deep forests to pass through. Some tourists inquire about the Coons mythology, according to local guide Jake Thornton, who offers approved hiking trips in the Buffalo National River region. Thornton acknowledges having his own unexplained experience near the former Coons property in October 2018, saying, "I tell them the facts, that there were disappearances, that the area has some unusual geological features, that parts of the old property are restricted for safety reasons. I don't embellish, but I don't dismiss it either. Something happened there. Whether it was something mundane that got exaggerated over time, or something truly unexplainable, I couldn't say. I was marking trail for a guided hike the next day, about half a mile from the restricted area. It was late afternoon, still plenty of light, when I heard what sounded like someone calling my name. Not loudly, more like a whisper that somehow carried through the trees. I called back, thinking it might be another hiker, but no one answered. He recalls feeling unexpectedly chilly, like walking into a refrigerated room, despite the pleasant autumn weather. Then I noticed the silence. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of leaves rustling, though I could see the trees moving in the breeze. It lasted maybe 30 seconds. Then everything was normal again. I've spent my whole life in these woods, and I've never experienced anything like that before or since. Natural reasons are suggested by science. Sinkholes are typical in karst terrain. Delusion and paranoia can result from isolation. Strange as they may be, coincidences are nonetheless coincidences. However, there are still unanswered questions. What did Ezra discover throughout his research? What was the phenomenon that he brought up with the enigmatic R.M., who eventually claimed the property by posing as Robert Marshfield? What indications did Holloway discover? What did Reynolds witness in the Earth's interior? The region beneath the former Coons property has an exceptionally intricate network of caverns and chambers, according to geological assessments carried out in 2019 using cutting-edge imaging techniques. While most of these features can be explained by natural karst processes, Dr. Rebecca Winters, whose team carried out the study, stated, pointing out a number of oddities. According to her published research, there are structures at approximately 70 feet below the surface that exhibit regularities not typically found in natural cave formations. Winters added that some areas showed signs of recent activity, with passages that seemed to have been open in surveys from the early 2000s now collapsing or filling, while new openings had appeared elsewhere. Perfectly circular chambers connected by straight passages at consistent angles. Nature tends to be more irregular. While we're not suggesting artificial construction, these features warrant further investigation. "The subterranean landscape is constantly changing," she noted. "But the rate and pattern of change in this particular location is unusual. The case's cyclical nature, the recurrent disappearances, usually around October, and always without a resolution, may be its most unsettling feature. The design alludes to something methodical, patient, and waiting for particular times to appear in the shadows of the Ozark forests. According to Park Service statistics, 7 hikers were reported missing within 5 miles of the former Coons Ranch between 1972 and 2020. 2 are still missing, but 5 were later located, physically unharmed but confused. Individuals who had allegedly shown interest in the Coons tale before their hiking excursions were engaged in both disappearances, which took place in October 1987 and 2003. The Buffalo National River attracts thousands of visitors annually, and Martha Burrows wrote in her final notes on the case, written just before her death, "I no longer believe we are dealing with murder or madness in any conventional sense. Whatever happened at the Coons property transcends ordinary criminal investigation. Some secrets are buried too deep, literally and figuratively, to be uncovered by conventional means. And perhaps some secrets should remain buried. They float its waterways, stroll its trails, and take in the untamed splendor of the Ozarks. Few are aware that they are close to the location of one of Arkansas's most puzzling mysteries. Even fewer can hear the murmurs that occasionally come from the dense forest on October evenings. Sounds like warnings, almost like words, but in the form of whispers." As part of his investigation into Ozark legends, Dr. Thomas Blackwood, a folklore professor at the University of Arkansas, has examined the Coons case. Blackwood observes that indigenous legends from before European settlement include references to places where the ground breathes and circles where the worlds touch, which are frequently linked to disappearances or transformations. "What makes this story compelling," he says, "is how it weaves together elements of documented fact, the disappearances, the unusual geological features, the recurring symbols, with the darker threads of folklore that run through these mountains. These mountains are ancient," he asserts. "They've been inhabited for thousands of years, and stories accumulate in landscapes like sediment, layer upon layer." What happened to Ezra Coons and the others may have been a modern chapter in a much older narrative. Remote sensing devices positioned close to the restricted region as part of an environmental monitoring research captured an uncommon occurrence in 2020 amid pandemic-related closures of the Buffalo National River. Over the course of 2 weeks in October, seismographs recorded what technicians referred to as microtremors, which are vibrations that are too small for people to feel, but that are regular in timing and pattern and happen every night between roughly 2 and 3 in the morning. The same location's audio equipment recorded what the monitoring report referred to as anomalous acoustic phenomena, rhythmic sounds that were below the normal human hearing threshold, but were obviously different from recognized geological or wildlife sources. Upon filtering and enhancing the recordings, acoustic researchers discovered patterns that were suggestive of communication, with consistent elements repeated in varying sequences. As this tale draws to a close, one last point is worth bringing up. According to Forest Service documents, the fencing had been breached during a routine examination of the restricted area in October 2017. Rangers discovered trekking gear inside the perimeter, including a flashlight, water bottle, and backpack, but no owner was visible. The equipment, which had obviously just been abandoned, was in good shape. There was never a missing person report that corresponded with the occurrence. Its owner was fascinated by the Coons legend and determined to find what lies beneath the circles. The journal's last entry, dated October 17th, states, "Made it past the fence just before sunset. The ground here feels different underfoot, almost like it's vibrating slightly. Found a depression that matches the descriptions, about 20 feet across and perfectly circular. The soil at the center looks disturbed, as if something has been digging from below. Going to set up camera traps before dark and wait. If I'm right, if the pattern holds, something should happen around midnight. The walls between worlds are thinnest now. The journal contains no name, and attempts to identify its owner using fingerprints or other forensic techniques were unsuccessful. The other equipment did not contain the camera traps that were stated in the entry. The Ozarks' walls conceal their secrets. The forest takes back its territory. Additionally, when October winds start to blow and the veils between worlds thin, locals in Jasper, Arkansas, still warn against going too far north of town. Among Martha Burroughs' painstaking notes and interviews in the Newton County Historical Society's archives is a single piece of paper that looks to be a transcription of part of Ezra Coons's last diary entry. In addition to the frequently used "it's in the walls," the entire passage, if true, provides a terrifying window into the final hours of Ezra. It's in the walls now. I can hear it moving, searching. The symbols Father carved only slow it down. They don't stop it anymore. Perhaps they never truly did. I understand now why Mother wasted away, why Father's heart gave out. It wasn't illness or age. It was the slow drain of whatever it takes from us. The Marshfield letters confirm what I've suspected. It needs our family, our bloodline, to maintain its presence here. Why us? I still don't know. Something in our veins it finds sustaining. Tomorrow I'll set the trap. The clothing on the bed should buy me time to reach the north field and collapse the entrance. If I succeed, let this record stand as warning. If I fail, God help whoever comes after me. The circles are thinning. October calls it forth. It is impossible to say whether these words are actually Ezra Coons's or if they are later embellishment. However, they reverberate through a century of unexplained incidents, missing persons, and hushed cautions. A history of mystery that lingers in the Ozarks' gloomy hollows.